Welcome for folks who are just joining us. Thank you for being here today. We will start in a few minutes. Please enter with your microphone muted so we can hear everyone when the speakers come on and get ready for a really rich conversation to come. Welcome. As you are coming into the room, we invite you now to share in the chat who you are and where you are. Please feel free to introduce yourself. We are so happy to see so many familiar faces and so many additional people entering as we speak. All right. We'll take one more minute, and we know folks are just joining us. Again, please enter your name, where you are in the chat. I'm going to ask if you can please go on mute. We're hearing a few voices, and so please make sure you're muted so we'll be able to hear the speakers. Welcome, Tor. Welcome, Sam. All right, I'm going to get started. We are so pleased to have you here for Better Preparedness, Funding Resilience, a week of learning labs. I know that some of you have joined us for 1 or 2 sessions already this week. They've been inspiring and sparked new ways of thinking and gathering. Today's conversation is going to be a rich one. We're focusing on decolonizing and localizing grant making. Just a few housekeeping things as we start. Captioning is available, and you can find that in the lower right of your screen. We also, again, ask that you please do mute yourself. We have incredible speakers, and we know that many of us are joining in from different locations, often from home. We would love to make sure we can hear them. Finally, this will be recorded. I want to say that the recording is both for this moment, for us to make sure that we can capture this later and share it out and make this conversation accessible to those who couldn't be with us today. We are also going to be sharing many different resources today, and I want you to be assured that you will be getting all of those resources in a follow-up message, and you will also be getting the slides from this presentation. So feel free to listen, to engage, to come with your questions. Why are we here? So at Human Rights Funders Network, where I'm the executive director, I realize I haven't introduced myself. I'm Kalia Miller, executive director of Human Rights Funders Network. On day 3 of these sessions, I realize I've gotten a little bit familiar with you all. We are here because we know that funders can do more to reach civil society groups and movements facing crisis and egregious human rights restrictions. We have been gathering for over several years, and in this year, we are particularly focused on what we are calling resilience, better preparedness. We're going to pause for a sec. Please do go on mute. Thank you so much. All right. Better preparedness, funding resilience. This is a year-long process in which funders can come together to build and strengthen the community and the tools necessary to reach those in crisis and facing human rights restrictions. In talking with many of you all, we know that this is something you face in your own institutions. We know also that we can do better, both as a field of funders and in collaboration with other fields, including with humanitarian sectors, which we'll be hearing from today, and with movements themselves. The way that we are doing this is by bringing funders together from peace and security and human rights spaces, along with civil society, to co-design a blueprint for better funder coordination. This also must be paired with building trust and the political will to deliver against it. We know that that starts with building community and knowledge, which is what this Learning Labs Week is a part of. The blueprint itself that we are developing is something that we have started over the year-long series, and by next year, hope to have a range of tools and approaches that you can use in your own funding and in your own institutions. This includes coordination principles, protocols and mechanisms, both for internal coordination and collaboration with others, crisis preparedness drills, bringing in the skills that we see from other fields, but as a field of philanthropy have not integrated into our work, mapping other foundations' work and the larger funding ecosystem. In our research, it was very clear that people know there is a need, but they don't know who is doing what and what kinds of risk and what kinds of approaches other peers are doing that can complement our work. This leads to taxonomies of risk and crisis and early warning systems, how we can better understand what restrictions and closing civic space mean now and fund before, during, and after crises occur. This process, as I said, is occurring over a full year. We started with a discovery period in May. You are now part of the Learning Labs Week. This for us is one of the key aspects. It's an open week where we can engage with different organizations, civil society members, as well as with funders to talk about key and emerging topics. This will lead into a period of co-design. That co-design period will be with what we call the core group. These are funders who are interested in participating in shaping that blueprint. If you're interested, we welcome you to join us. That is a more intensive process that will take place about monthly over the next few months. You can see in the chat ways to join. Finally, next year, we will validate the blueprint. We will have additional conversations that are open for input, and we will try to bring this into a new level where we can get the leadership buy-in to be able to implement more effective preparedness for crisis contexts and closing civic space. Finally, this day is part of the Learning Labs Week. Again, many of you have been a part of that. We are on our third session, and we have one more tomorrow on AI and human rights. With that, it is my great honor and pleasure to turn over to Heba Ali, the CEO of the New Humanitarian, which is the world's only newsroom dedicated to covering humanitarian crises. Heba, thank you so much for moderating today's conversation and for all the work that you are doing to shift conversations about localization and decolonizing funding and the larger aid infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kalia. And I tend to speak faster than Kalia does, so forgive me in advance if that ruins the captioning. It's great to be here, and as journalists who cover the impact of humanitarian crises around the world, it's also great to see philanthropic foundations getting more and more into this space. It's much needed. And as Kalia said, we are reporting on both the needs on the ground, but also the way that the world responds to them. And so the policy and practice of aid, particularly in the humanitarian sector. And as part of that work, we've been leading a conversation on decolonizing aid since the concept kind of reemerged in 2020. So we'll drop a few links in the chat for those who are interested in a few more resources, and you can sign up to our newsletter if you want to keep up with some of these conversations that are happening in the broader sector. So today we are going to try to get at how civil society access to funding can be democratized and what role decolonizing and localizing grant making can play in that. And I want to distinguish between those two terms because you'll hear things that are probably on different ends of that spectrum. And we've, in our analysis on this topic, have interviewed a lot of people, and many people define this quite differently. So I just wanted to speak to that. I think some people think of, when we talk about decolonization, they think of DEI, so, tackling racism. Some people think of localization, in other words, devolving power. Some people think of being more accountable to the people affected by crises. And none of these alone, in my view, is decolonization. And so it's, I think, important to distinguish between locally led, which is often used, but doesn't necessarily take into account that racial justice and equality and inequality element, versus decolonization, which, as I see it, is a broader kind of umbrella term that refers to dismantling inequitable power dynamics. And that can be either within philanthropy and aid or outside of it. So I'll stop there on definitions, but other bits of what we're going to try to give you some answers to today are at both a strategy level as well as on a programming level. What are examples of success in decolonizing or localizing philanthropy, and how can coordination between funders, as Clay was saying, and particularly funders of civil society that are facing acute human rights or longer term challenges to civic space, and in the crisis domain in particular, how can coordination among that group of funders be improved? So we're going to hear from a few speakers, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. You can already start putting your questions into the Zoom chat as they come to you, and a moderator will reach out to you if your question is selected, and then we'll ask you later to unmute and ask your question yourself. So if you do ask a question, be ready to come on screen, and you can also share your reflections in the chat as we go along. So I'll briefly introduce our speakers. We have with us today Helena Hofbauer, who is the International Program Director for Civic Engagement and Government, as well as the Director for Mexico and Central America at the Ford Foundation. And she is joining us today from Mexico City. Hi, Helena. She should be there somewhere. You'll see her soon.
Hello.
There she is.
Sorry, I was.
She's on mute, of course. So Helena will bring us the perspective of a major funder. We will also hear from Anisha Chug, the Executive Director of Women's Fund Asia, who is joining today from New Delhi, and will give us that perspective of someone who's sitting between the kind of big funders and the local grassroots organizations and able to pass money in between. Hi, Anisha. And finally, Degan is the executive director of Adesso, and a civil society activist that has been pushing for the changes that you will hear about throughout the conversation, and that has been taking steps to make it more possible for the flow of capital to reach local organizations. And she's joining us today from Nairobi. Hi, Degan.
Hi, Heba.
So I think we'll kick things off with Helena, who will share with us a little bit of Ford's policy level outlook and some of the approaches at the strategic level, at the programmatic level, and at the practical level to advancing this agenda. And I'd love, Helena, if you could also speak a little bit to how you overcome internal challenges in doing so. Over to
you. Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here and to be able to have a reflection, a collective reflection with all of you about these issues, about decolonizing and localizing. And I also extend them to empowering, which each of us tackle differently depending on the institutional setup that we're in. If we can move to the first slide, please. I want to say that first and foremost, I want to be very open and very honest with you. At Ford, we don't have quite a participatory grant making practice. And we actually don't really speak that much about decolonizing grant making. However, I believe that we have gone a long way in trying to shift the power relation between us and our partners. And I on purpose call them partners and not grantees. Because while this is a highly political conversation, and there are always ways in which we can move ahead with this political conversation and this political practice of decolonizing, even if we don't spell it out like that. And spelling it out like that or not depends very much of what we can do within our institutions. So always keep in mind that we are constrained by a series of factors, and we do the best within that. And we can push the envelope and we can push it harder within the limits that are established. Ultimately, the relationship between funders and grantees or partners is symbiotic. And that means that we both are constrained by different things, but we can try to do the best out of the power that we can generate together. If we shift to the next slide, please. Ford started to shift in 2016, importantly away from what we had been using before that, which was project support in a very big extent, to what we call general or core support, which is basically support that is not constrained, that is not the budget, which is not earmarked for specific things, and that gives partners the biggest ability to move. We have shifted from project to core support in an amount of 36% in 2015 to 82% in this year, which means that the vast majority of our funding is now multi-year and unrestricted. In addition to that, we shifted to providing 25% to project support in indirect costs to make sure that grantees can actually face the costs that they have to do the work that they do. And we launched the Build Initiative, which is this $2 billion 10-year initiative in which we provide 5-year support, unrestricted, together with institutional support. 44% of this support is US focused, 56% has an international focus, which not necessarily means a local focus. If we shift to the next slide, in Build, what we're trying to do is to improve capacities, create more resilient organizations, more effective organizations, and that have a better chance of impacting the issues on which they work. And in the words of our partners, this has given them a lot of bandwidth, possibility to innovate, space to fail, etc. However, and now let's shift to the next slide. However, Build only reaches a certain amount of organizations, not because we want to, but because of how the initiative is framed. By definition, it only lasts for so long. In 2020, during the pandemic, Ford started another effort or launched a one-time effort to try to support institutions weather the crisis of the pandemic and give them the best capacity to respond to the situation. And we did that by launching a social justice bond, which was again a $1 billion initiative to support civil society during those years. All programs and offices had the possibility of doing with that money, which was obviously divided in regions, etc., whatever they chose in order to strengthen civil society. The Civic Engagement and Government Program at the international level, decided to do what we called our best and strongest bet to increase the resilience of civil society in a context of closing space under the pandemic and beyond. So we worked with other international programs within Ford and with regional offices and with other donors in some of the regions to launch Weaving Resilience, which is a US 75 million initiative, which I will go further into. Next slide, please. Weaving Resilience is by far our most outspoken effort in terms of localization and decolonization. It does not dictate how organizations should work to conceptualize their work or to support others beyond broad focus areas. It does not use intermediaries. It gives resources directly to organizations in the Global South to work with organizations in the Global South without having to pay overheads that stay in some Global North organizations. and it does not create coordinating structures, allowing the organizations that are part of the initiative to define how it works and how they will connect. Next slide, please. Weaving resilience as such is anchored in 4 principles, which I call the anti-principles, because by using the anti to define them, we're actually not only saying what we are for, but what we are against. So the 4 principles are anti-colonial, anti-patriarchal, anti-racist, and anti-ableist. And the organizations that are part of the initiative are supposed to, not all of them own these principles already, but progressively move towards them in order to provide services to civil society in ways that pushes the envelope in this understanding. And you will be able to read more about them in detail when you get the slides, but here you have like the big frame of them. If we go to the next slide, which I think is the last, what this initiative does is that it works with 35 organizations in 8 regions around the world who work together in 22 countries and who provide services to movements, social justice leaders, and civil society organizations at different levels in order to strengthen their priority core capacities and weather the onslaught on civic space and essential human rights that is happening in different regions. So these 35 organizations that are part of Weaving Resilience provide services in these 3 buckets: strategic relevance, institutional resilience, and wellness and safety. And all of them define what they do in ways that are politically adequate for their context, very grounded in the realities where they work, and adaptive to what is happening in the regions. And they provide these services to hundreds of organizations and movements around the world in order to ensure that those movements are better prepared to face the circumstances in which they operate. What is important of this initiative is that it is an example of what you can do as an individual or as a program within an organization that operates under bigger constraints. Ford and all of you have constraints that are dictated by our boards, by circumstances, by how our funding flows, etc. But what we can do within our programs and as individuals is to define the best ways possible to bend the rules in order to get as close as we can to the ground. And here, this is an example of it because in reality, we had very little margin to make a short or a small number of grants with the resources that we had under the social justice bond. As an international program, this would have meant for me to make 5 grants to international organizations. But by working with other programs and with other offices, I was able to extend the reach of what we wanted to do as a program. We were able to then get much closer to the ground to really identify organizations that come from the global south and are rooted and based in the global south, to work with organizations in the global south for the purposes that are defined in the global south, circumventing all kinds of trends of only working with service providers that are in the global north, who dictate how we in the global south have to understand the challenges and what we do with those challenges. So I will stop here so that I don't run over time. I think that I ran over by a minute, so I will stop. Thank you very much, and I'm waiting for your questions and reflections.
Muchas gracias, Helena. And I really like that that comment about bending the rules and what you said earlier about pushing the envelope within the limits established. And it reminds me of a convening that I attended in fact, with Kalea and the Human Rights Funders Network, among a group of funders, and it really seemed to me that all of those who found creative solutions did so because they pushed the limits and didn't just accept the constraints that were imposed upon them. So a very interesting model in that regard. I'm going to turn next to Anisha. And Anisha, I'd love if you could tell us a little bit about what decolonizing means to you, what it looks like in theory, what it looks like in practice, and what operating in a highly challenging environment like India looks like when it comes to localization. What are the kind of implications for localization in a context like that, and what are some practical solutions that you are trying to overcome that? Over to you.
Thank you, Heba. I'm really excited to be part of this space because I think we need more such spaces for such disruptive conversations. To me, and I'm only going to talk about, I think not in terms of the theory of decolonization, but where I'm sitting from and from my experience. What does it mean to me? And to me, the conversation on decolonizing philanthropy and aid has to first start by acknowledging that resources, and specifically when I say resources, I mean money, is political. In this context of money being political, decolonizing means giving up power, control, narrow agendas that pretty much dictate how the money will flow, to whom it will flow, and for what purpose, and more importantly, what conditionalities and restrictions will be imposed. The other critical aspect of this is whose reality or realities gets centered, who gets left behind, who is completely invisibilized, and who is forgotten. And we have clearly seen this over the last two to 3 years specifically, when we've been hit by one crisis after the other. We say that we are in a state of polycrisis, multi-crisis. And not only the pandemic, and we saw how pandemic impacted different experiences and identities differently, how it was addressed, but also what we have seen over the last couple of years about what the responses have been, whether it was Afghanistan vis-a-vis Ukraine, Sudan, Myanmar, and now Palestine. So I think that kind of discriminatory response also needs to be addressed quite head on if we are talking about decolonizing philanthropy. The strategies and priorities that are being set need to speak to the diverse realities and experiences of various individuals and communities. And hence, philanthropy and aid needs to be movement-centered, and the accountability hence needs to lie to these movements and not to institutional objectives or compliances. I think the issue or the concept of accountability, we really need to have more conversation around that. It usually gets wrapped up into what was the report that was submitted. It's very short-sighted. It's very, we reduce it to tools rather than a principle. So I think we need to have more conversations around where the accountability lies. Today, there is a lot more conversation around decolonization, but I don't know how much of it. I think something that you said really resonated with me in the beginning is that we also need to unpack that further, because we need to have conversations also around racial justice, caste, religion, ableism, and language, and many other issues. So there are different layers, and it can't be just like a one-dimensional view of the issue around decolonization. We also need to address what is actually being practiced and what is not being practiced. So on one hand, we say we have conversations around decolonizing philanthropy, and then we see continuous practices, exclusionary practices. So very simple, applications. The language is usually the colonized languages, the colonizer languages of English, Spanish, French. We don't see local languages, in which you will have applications, management requirements, reporting requirements, and something that we get a lot more as feminist organizations is, do you have the absorption capacity? So, and all these questions are still very, very much there, right? They're still being asked, they're still being demanded on. And very closely linked with this, hence, becomes the issue of localization, where instead of strengthening and amplifying communities and local voices and experiences, localization has ended up in many instances instrumentalizing local organizations and movements, where resources then finally end up in the hands of entities which do have absorption capacity, reporting capacity, management capacities, and they usually tend to be national entities of either international organizations or local offices of multilateral organizations or even local embassies. And it becomes a very vicious cycle for local organizations who are the main implementers of a lot of the programs, but do not get their fair share of resources. And these are the very groups who we see are struggling for basic survival. And that then tends to reduce local experiences and communities, and it tokenizes them. So I think that is another critical issue we need to address. And given the current hostile political environment that we are operating in, especially in Asia, where civil society is under increased surveillance, and movements require resources to just survive, we come up with questions of, so what is the innovation here? What is the innovative or the uniqueness about what you are proposing? And what we are proposing is, I just need to survive this one more year. I need to have enough resources to absorb the backlash. I need to have enough resources to stand by with the communities. So I think that survival mode that a lot of organizations and movements are in, also I think philanthropy has an obligation to them to, how do we get to a stage where we move from survival to thriving? The women's funds globally, we are, as part of the Prospera network, we are around 50 women's funds and feminist funds. And if you look at, on an average, the approval or rate of eligible applications that we get, it's between 20 to 30%. That is almost 70% of eligible applications are not receiving funding. And that is because of lack of funding, increase in demand that is there, because a lot of institutions such as ours actually do provide resources to local groups, unregistered organizations, individual activists. And these are the main groups that actually are at the front lines of a lot of crises that we are seeing. During the pandemic, many organizations in the region actually shut down or could not go on further. And it was not because, well, the pandemic did it to them. It was because they were not adequately resourced. If they were adequately resourced, they would have been in a better and a stronger position to, to absorb that backlash that we are seeing. Some of the, and it's not a challenging task. There are very practical solutions to this. And we see a lot of the institutions such as other human rights funders and feminist funds doing this. So when it comes to accessibility and inclusivity, what does it mean? We usually see accessibility and inclusivity also being tokenized now. Intentional inclusivity is what we need, and for that we need to put in resources. So for example, with Women's Fund Asia, our call for applications on our small grants program actually goes out in 15 different languages. It takes a lot of time and effort for us to do that. We need to have more conversations on what does trust-based philanthropy mean. Again, that's another conversation that's happening, but how is it actually being practiced? Are we actually trusting the movements in the relationship that we have with them? And how do we have more institutional partnerships and relationships? Because a lot of the times the relationships between civil society organizations and funders also relies very heavily on individuals and champions within those organizations, because organizations, as Helena also mentioned, do operate in a more restrictive space, and they have their own limitations. So how do we also build up the champions inside these institutions, so that we have more stronger institutional commitment in terms of philanthropy and aid? And I think lastly, I would also say that I think we need to have more such conversations. We need to have more such disruptive conversations around decolonization, around trust-based philanthropy, and we need to have more voices bringing in their different perspectives and experiences. Thank you.
I like to think of it as actually a research project at ODI, formerly known as the Overseas Development Institute, once called it constructive deconstruction, rather than just deconstruct, or what did you call it? Destructive, yeah. But thank you, Anisha. A very different picture there on defining decolonization. I think, Helena painted a picture for us of what a large foundation like Ford is doing to try to get funding to more proximate actors, as they're often called. But from you, I'm hearing some more complex ideas around what decolonization is, including, for example, who gets support in the first place and who doesn't, and who's left out of that. I'm going to remind everyone that you can put your questions in the chat as you're listening, because we're going to turn to them shortly. Before we do, we'll turn to Degan for well, first of all, for Adesso's journey in kind of looking at the changes needed in the aid architecture and some of the practical approaches that you've been developing to deal with some of the obstacles to localizing philanthropy. But also I'm interested in hearing from you your reactions to, for instance, what Helena has laid out in terms of whether that goes far enough in what you're looking for from funders in this space.
Yeah, thank you, Heba, and it's a great opportunity to be here with all three of you. And so before, let me just first go back a step and let's talk about this definitions question and what was just talked about in terms of whatever, you know what I mean, of this locally led. And I completely agree with that. And as someone who led this movement on localization in 2014 and 2016 during the World Humanitarian Summit, and leading to the grand bargain of 25%, what we were speaking about was very political. And what was a very political conversation became a very basic conversation around, okay, let's move money to local actors only, and let's give them an opportunity to participate in spaces and decision-making forums. And it's a real concern for us that locally led and localization are being interchangeably used with other things like decolonization, which is intentionally very political. I want to just talk a little bit about what does the political really mean in addition to what was just highlighted, which everything that was said so far I completely agree with and resonates with me. But I would just like to go a further step and say that if we're really talking about resilience and making things political, and the statement that was made that money is political and where you put the money is a very political decision, I would like to say that we need to go to the next stage and say we shouldn't be shying away from money and having a really hard conversation about money. And I feel like what happens with activists is that we shy away from capitalism and say we don't want money and we just want to be pure social justice actors, when we are acknowledging that money is the engine that moves the machine of our activism. And so for me, what I would like to talk about in terms of creating resilience is how do we financially liberate ourselves as civil society actors from being in this perpetual position of being beggars and the starvation cycle we're in. And I think that's a conversation that we're uncomfortable in having. And as a DESO, in terms of our journey, we started off initially trying to have a very political conversation about the architecture, why we are still in poor and poverty situation in the global South, why the UN exists in the way it does, and it can't resolve conflicts in many parts of the world, including the current conflict in Israel and Palestine. So it was a very political kind of conversation, and it translated into a transactional conversation around money. And money is important, but I want money to liberate me from ever needing you and from being in a completely position of equality. And for me, when I'm DESO is decolonized, fully decolonized as an institution, is when I have a serious endowment and I can co-finance my own projects, and I can come to you, Helena, as Ford, and say, I have $1 million to put at the table for this initiative. Do you want to co-finance it with me? That is real power. And I feel like to get to that level of power, it means that the Global North funders need to be ready to fund and resource endowments. And all we hear when we talk about endowments is, oh, we're anti-capitalist and the Global North foundations need to be spending down their endowments. And why are we, if we're talking about decolonization, why are we being pro-endowments and creating the same structures as the Global North? Well, I'm sorry, that's a position of privilege and elitism. You've never been hungry for resources. You've never been in the position of trying to figure out how do you keep your lights on during COVID, and do you pay salaries or do you pay rent? You've never been in that position. And so that's a position of privilege. And for those of us in the Global South who haven't been in that privilege, I mean, you can just look at the Mackenzie Scott windfall that many actors got, and you can see that, at least for us as a DESO, we immediately understood that what we need to do with that 5 million was to figure out how to never be hungry again and never be in this position of having to be under-resourced and be professional beggars. How do we liberate ourselves from being professional beggars? And whereas a lot of Global North institutions that had the windfall, all they did is go into their INGO cycle of expansion, hiring more people, paying salaries. And then a year or 2 years later, the money's finished and they say, oh gosh, what am I going to do to sustain the structure? Well, why did you become fat in the first place? Why weren't you not thinking about being financially sustainable? So I think that's a really an important for me. So I think the BUILD program and what Ford is doing is trailblazing, because there is no other foundation that's doing that. So I was very pro BUILD from day one when I heard about it. But I think one element that BUILD is missing is to say, in that 10 years, we're going to invest in your ability to create an endowment. In that 10 years, we're going to strategically support you so that you don't longer need us, that you have a sustainable financial model as an organization. And that is real, serious resilience, and that's serious power. And you know, the wealth managers that Ford has to invest their resources, why aren't those same wealth managers from Goldman Sachs working with the Global South institutions, partners of BUILD? They should be. They should be helping them to figure out how to invest their money. Why don't we have access to those kinds of resources from these foundations? So, you know, this is, I think, the next level for me of what real decolonization is. Now, practically on locally led and localization, well, okay, I'll talk about another thing in that very political angle. So one of the things we're trying to work on right now as a DESO is build an Africa fund called the Proximate Fund that does a couple of things. One, we want to have an investment arm of the fund. So the fund is investing whatever money we get from philanthropy. So the fund is completely replenished constantly. So again, the fund is not always fundraising. We don't want to be in 20 years continually raising money as a fund, number one. Number two, every single partner of the fund that gets money will get supported to make sure that they have, if they are interested, that they have a pathway to creating their own endowment. It might be as small as $1 million. It might be as big as $50 million, whatever their, based on their capacity and their size, is what we're looking at. And third is to fund those institutions that are invisible and unfunded, and doing the work to be able to fund the person that's leading a movement, an individual or 3 individuals who don't have institutions. That it's only the feminist funds that do that kind of funding. If we're really political, we have to fund movements, and we're not really structured in our compliance system to fund in that way. It's only the feminist groups. But what happens if you're a male-led organization and you're not working on feminist issues, you're working on climate issues, you're working on health issues, and you're working in a very radical way, but you don't get the resources because you're 1 or 2 individuals? Does that mean you shouldn't get access to resources? So I think this is where we need to go to the next stage, and that's what we're trying to create in this kind of fund. And it's right now, it's just limited to Africa. So when you talk about locally led and localization, there are things that we are trying to move the needle a little bit. And I will say a little bit because we have to understand that everybody is in a journey. We might be much more radical as an organization, and we might want everybody to be as radical as us, but we know that that's not realistic. And we can't judge people based on where they are, and they have to get there slowly. So we are figuring out, like, how do we help funders like Hilton or Ford or whoever it may be find more local, unfunded, invisible grassroots organizations or leaders? And to do that, we are creating a platform called Kuja Link, where organizations can upload their profile and be visible. It's like a LinkedIn for civil society. It's not specific to humanitarian, it's everyone. If you want to find a health actor working in Liberia on Ebola crisis, you can find them. If you want to find them working on human rights in Uganda, you can find them. So that's one. And then another service or thing that we want to do is exactly addressed Anisha's point about how in the localization agenda, the groups that benefit from this process are the middle and the larger national institutions, and a lot of them are INGOs in disguise. That's the reality. So what we are trying to figure out is how to support them to be more compliant. How do we help them to have the back office systems that they currently don't have, and that will take them years to build, and they shouldn't invest in that. Honestly, that shouldn't be the things that they invest their time and energy. They should be investing their time and energy in doing the work that they need to do with the communities or the movements or whatever that they're doing. And so we are building a private company where Global South organizations, small grassroots organizations, can outsource their back office, their HR, their procurement, their finance. What is available to most American institutions, small and medium-sized nonprofits, is not available to institutions in Africa or the Philippines or India. So this is a company that we're building. And then lastly, I will just say that we are trying to change the behavior of the INGOs little bit at a time. It's really like, it's like moving the Titanic. The machinery is not meant to go out of business. The machinery is not meant to go to become extinct and really be locally led. It's not designed to do that. But we are trying to work with leadership and CEOs of few INGOs, right now 13, who have signed on to this document called the Pledge for Change. And I'll send a link of that later. And it's about 3 commitments. So we've said, what can you do tangibly to change your behavior when you come into our countries? One is partnership. How do you partner with us so that you don't treat us like subcontractors, you treat us as real partners? Second, and then give us real overheads, give us proper resourcing, and you don't just treat us as partners for a particular project. Second is, how do you do storytelling better? How do you stop using poverty porn to raise money as Save the Children, using Black and brown children all the time, these terrible images to raise resources? And this is not just Save the Children, all of them do that. So storytelling. And the third is, how do you change and influence your peers and your back donors? If you're Plan International UK, how do you change the UK government and DFID policies and programs? So those are very light touch. It felt like a very painful process to convince these INGO leaders to do those three things. But that was, to us, a huge achievement, because getting them to even acknowledge some of these things about poverty porn, getting them to acknowledge some of these things about partnership and how it's very colonial and racist, and how they work with Global South organizations was very, very difficult. So anyways, I just want to talk about those practical solutions. Over to you, Heba.
Thank you, Degan, and thanks for taking us from the very mega picture to the practical level. I, in particular, appreciate some of that emphasis on how do you actually give Global South organizations the same chance that organizations in the North have, whether it's through access to wealth managers or through endowments. I'm going to jump right into questions because we've only got 10 minutes, and I had promised to put you all on camera, but in the interest of getting through as many questions as possible, I'm going to just read them out quickly. In answer to one that just came up in response to a comment just off the back of Degan's remarks, I think it might be useful, and it was around absorptive capacity and what we mean by that. And I think what Kalea was referring to in the chat there is that often, and Anisha mentioned as well, the obstacle to localization is, well, local organizations can't absorb this much money. And what Kalea was referring to there is, what if we flip the switch in line with kind of the way Degan's been outlining in her remarks, and say, well, actually, maybe the lack of capacity is on the donor side in being able to channel that money to local organizations. So that was what that comment was about. I'm going to jump to a question from Avi, and it's for you, Helena. And I think there's a lot of interest in understanding a bit the practicalities of how all of this works. He asks, how does Ford reach smaller organizations in the Global South without utilizing intermediaries? And then he refers to this absorptive capacity question, saying these smaller organizations often can't absorb larger grants, and it takes more work on the grant making side to give more grants to many small organizations. So how did you overcome that challenge? And perhaps it's something you can jump in really briefly on as well, Anisha, in terms of how you managed to give resources to unregistered groups. And then very quickly, Helena, also for you, and what is the distinction between the Weaving Resilience program and the Build program in terms of the type of grantees that are eligible?
Do you want me to start?
Yes, please go ahead.
So first and foremost, thank you, Degan, for everything that you said. I worked in civil society all my life before joining Ford, and I completely share where you're coming from. And I think that once we are in positions in foundations, what we have to do is to try to get as closest to what we know is true and to what we know is the challenge. In order to go back to these questions, the main difference between Build and Weaving Resilience is that Build gives 5-year unrestricted support and institutional strengthening to organizations. But those organizations are 400 organizations within the whole universe of Ford's partners or grantees. Weaving Resilience gives support, 5-year support, unrestricted, to organizations that will provide support to organizations, not grants. Support to organizations in order to address their financial capacities, their strategic adaptation capacities, their well-being, etc. And these organizations work with all kinds of organizations, not only for grantees. So precisely the purpose is that this initiative has an ecosystemic approach, because it goes far beyond Ford grantees to work with all kinds of smaller organizations, organizations that don't work in the fields in which Ford works, etc. And what is important there is that, yes, indeed, it meant making more grants, smaller grants, which is what donors usually don't want to do. And that is why working within our own network of offices, programs, etc., we pulled together efforts in order to do that. And we wanted to do it like that because instead of giving monies to intermediaries that then would be channeled out with very clear constraints and frames to the field. We wanted to reach the organizations and give them the money to have adequate overheads, etc., whatever they wanted to build up their own capacities over the years.
But Helena,
instead of
how did you
doing-
manage to do that?
How did we manage to do what? Sorry.
To be able to actually channel that money to such small organizations without using an intermediary?
It wasn't small, it isn't necessarily small organizations. It is organizations in the global south. Instead of working with intermediaries that then would reach those organizations. And those organizations work with a lot of smaller organizations. But we wanted to reach smaller organizations directly through organizations based in the countries,
I see.
grounded in the
Okay.
context.
So the shift is that the intermediary is a Global South organization.
The service provider is a Global South organization.
Okay.
It's not an intermediary because they don't hand out money. They provide services.
I see. Okay. Maybe Anisha, you could come in very briefly on that if you've got anything to add in terms of how you actually manage for those grant makers listening who want to do some of this work in funding the unregistered movements, et cetera. How do you do that given all of the usual compliance and regulations that they're subjected to?
So one of the things that we say as a women's fund and a feminist fund, our main job is to manage compliances, administration of how the money flows to the groups on the ground. And one of the things that we do is that we do fund unregistered organizations and collectives. But I will also say that in the last couple of years, it's become extremely challenging in some of the countries where surveillance has increased, laws have been introduced, which have made it even more difficult in supporting collectives. And we are figuring out ways of how to do that, different kinds of contracts, fiscal sponsorships. We're constantly innovating and working with other peers and allies to get resources down to the groups. But one of the ways to reach out to a lot of the unregistered collectives and groups are not your English-speaking groups, are not based in capital cities. So one of the ways in reaching out to them has been that what I mentioned, that ensuring that the calls for applications are going in local languages, that we are actually reaching out to local networks and distributing the calls with them. We make a lot of effort in outreach, and that's where a lot of investment is also done. So it can't be that you put out a call for application on your website and it's done. So how do you reach out to those groups? We do from webinars to field visits to reaching out to other allies, existing partners. It's a lot of effort that goes into this outreach, because we feel it is our obligation to reach out to the groups, and the groups should not be coming looking to us. It should be the other way.
It speaks to exactly the point we were talking earlier on Uditi's question around capacity, that actually it's a capacity gap on the donor side not to do the kind of work that you've just described. In the interest of time, I'm just going to ask one final question to all of you, although Helena, I'll note that there's a question for you also around whether you can share more about Ford's sign on to the localization agenda. So if you've got any more details on that, if you could drop it into the chat. But I'll close with this question, which is, to what extent does the panel feel that funders are using the decolonization and localization narrative to whitewash themselves? Degan, maybe I can start with you.
I think there's more whitewashing probably happening from INGOs than the funders. I mean foundations, philanthropy. I'm not talking about bilaterals. I do believe bilateral funders are whitewashing completely and not very serious about this agenda. But I think the philanthropists, honestly, I don't think they understand what is the difference. And it's so subtle. And there's so much language out there. There's the locally led, localization, decolonization, trust-based, participatory grant making, shifting power. it's just a plethora of language, and I could just see why people are confused. I think we need to be a little bit fair. I don't think philanthropy has been acclimated to this issue as long as the bilaterals have. The bilaterals have had since 2014. They've had plenty of time, and they're not interested. So let's just move on from the bilaterals. So I think philanthropy has had only a few years. I think we can make a judgment on whether they are whitewashing. I think in another few years. I think it's too soon to make a judgment on that. But I do feel that INGOs are whitewashing. And I think the funders have to make sure that they are funding intermediaries who are genuinely serious about this issue. And I think that the onus is on the philanthropists and the funders in that area.
You're becoming more optimistic over time, Degan. Helena, what's your thought? Are funders using decolonization and localization narratives to whitewash themselves?
Oh my God, I want to believe that we are pushing as much as we can, but I think that we can always push harder. I mean, I think that there are pockets in philanthropy which are using the language to whitewash themselves, and I think that there are other pockets who are trying to change the dynamics and the logic of philanthropy and how philanthropy approaches this thing that I want to go back to what I said at the beginning, this symbiotic relationship. I want to believe that we as philanthropy work with our partners in as much as a relationship as our partners work with us. I mean, if you think of organizations only seeing philanthropy as bags of money, there is a problem in that, because in reality, philanthropy has goals and purposes also. The same way if which philanthropy only sees organizations of vessels to do things that they want to do. I mean, so as long as we remain stuck in that kind of conversation, we will not be able to talk about the power that both sides need to share and to have and to hand over in terms from philanthropy to organizations in order to move our agendas forward. Organizations do not, I mean, we have to move beyond instrumentalizing organizations, but we also have to move beyond instrumentalizing philanthropy only as a source of money. We can do so much more if we see each other together in a different way.
Very diplomatically articulated. Anisha, last word to you on the whitewashing question, and I know we're over time, but we'll close right after this.
I think I would say that there is a danger of it being whitewashed. If we don't keep pushing, like Helena said. I said in the beginning that this is a disruptive conversation. I will still stand by it's a disruptive conversation, but then I also hear you, Heba. I hope it gets to a place where it is constructive. And right now, the danger, as Degan said, it does come from a lot of the northern-based INGOs who are definitely seeing this as competition for resources or funding or being extremely territorial around a lot of issues. So there is a danger of it being whitewashed, but at the same time, it has also led to a lot of critical conversations and issues that have come up. I really specifically do want to point out the conversation that has started in a wonderful article by Prachi Patankar on Brahmanizing philanthropy, right? Like that really pushes the decolonizing, looking at decolonizing it in a different light, especially if we are sitting within our context here, right? So I think those are very important conversations to have. They will definitely push the agenda, but we need to keep pushing and having these conversations and ensuring more voices, especially the voices from the South, from from the experiences of marginalization are actually being part of such conversations. And it's not just a group of us who speak a particular language, come from a particular space of privilege, are participating in these conversations. Then it gets, I feel, then there is a danger of it being whitewashed.
I will note that there are some in the chat who take a more critical view to this question, so do look there if you want to find out more. But we're going to have to end there. I want to thank all of you for coming, and Helena, Degan, and Anisha for your thoughts. I think we've heard a range of things from what some of the big philanthropies that may not use this kind of radical terminology are doing to try to shift towards more core funding and more generous use of or provision of overheads to allow local organizations to thrive, to specifically and intentionally funding feminist anti-colonial movements that are challenging some of these structures, to specific tools that are being created in order to help funders on this journey, whether it's the back-end service provision to local organizations or the civil society linked in. But I think also a strong message there around the political nature of decolonization and what that entails in terms of looking beyond how much money is being channeled towards what is the overall power ecosystem in which this work exists. Claire, should I hand over to you for a final word before we close?
Just going to say thank you to everyone. For those of you still on, we welcome you to do an emoji. You all know the drill by now, to show your appreciation or to put information into the chat. Just to thank you to everyone who is here. This conversation will continue. I know we want more. We think better to leave you wanting more than wanting less. So please feel free to stay connected to HRFN and stay in touch. Thank you again. Bye, everyone.